The sound of expensive heels echoing through the marble corridor stopped exactly where arrogance meets consequence, at the threshold of Judge Elias Monroe's courtroom. If this story resonates with you, give it a like and let's continue. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the federal courthouse, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches. The air hung heavy with anticipation, thick enough to taste. In the gallery, reporters clutched their notebooks, cameras poised, sensing that today's proceedings would be anything but routine. At the defense table sat Victoria Ashford, 28 years old, draped in a designer suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, her blonde hair styled to perfection, her expression one of practiced boredom mixed with barely concealed contempt. She examined her manicured nails as if the entire judicial system were nothing more than an inconvenient delay in her day. Victoria was the eldest daughter of Governor Richard Ashford, a man whose political dynasty stretched back 3 generations. She'd grown up in the governor's mansion, attended the most prestigious schools money could access, and had learned from birth that her last name was a shield against the ordinary rules that governed ordinary people. The charges before the court today suggested she'd taken that lesson too far. 6 months earlier, Victoria had been driving her custom Mercedes-Benz through downtown at 11 o'clock on a Saturday night. Security footage would later show her vehicle weaving between lanes, accelerating through yellow lights, treating the city streets like her personal racetrack. At the intersection of Madison and 5th, she'd blown through a red light at 60 miles per hour. The impact was catastrophic. Maria Santos, a 53-year-old nurse returning home from a double shift at the hospital, never saw it coming. Her sedan was crushed like paper, spinning 3 times before slamming into a traffic pole. Maria survived, but barely. 3 surgeries, 4 months of intensive care, permanent nerve damage to her spine, and medical bills that had already consumed her life savings and her family's future. Her daughter had dropped out of college to help care for her. Her husband had taken a second job. Their lives had been shattered in the seconds it took for Victoria Ashford to decide that red lights were suggestions rather than laws. The toxicology report from that night showed Victoria's blood alcohol content at nearly twice the legal limit. The passenger in her car, a fellow socialite, had testified to investigators that Victoria had consumed multiple cocktails at a charity gala earlier that evening and had laughed off suggestions that she take a car service home. "Do you know who my father is?" she'd reportedly said. "Nobody's going to pull me over." Judge Elias Monroe entered the courtroom with the measured pace of a man who'd presided over thousands of cases and yet treated each one as if it were his first. At 63, his silver hair was impeccably combed. His black robes hung perfectly from his shoulders, and his face bore the lines of someone who'd seen humanity at its best and worst. His eyes, a piercing gray, missed nothing. He took his seat at the bench, adjusted his reading glasses, and surveyed the room with the quiet authority of someone who'd never needed to raise his voice to command absolute respect. "Please be seated," he said, his voice calm and measured. The room settled into an expectant silence. "We are here today for the sentencing of Victoria Catherine Ashford," Monroe continued, opening the file before him. "Ms. Ashford, please stand." Victoria rose slowly, deliberately, as if the very act of standing for a judge was beneath her station. Her attorney, Marcus Wellington, a silver-haired defense lawyer whose fees started at $1,000 per hour, stood beside her, his face professionally neutral. Monroe reviewed the documents before him. "Ms. Ashford, you were convicted by a jury of your peers of driving under the influence causing serious bodily injury, reckless endangerment, and leaving the scene of an accident. Before I impose sentence, I'm required to ask if you wish to make a statement to the court." Victoria glanced at her attorney, who gave her a subtle shake of his head, a clear signal that silence would serve her better. But Victoria Ashford had never been good at following advice that didn't align with her own sense of superiority. "Yes, Your Honor, I would," she said, her voice carrying that peculiar accent of the privately educated elite, crisp, measured, and dripping with entitlement. Monroe gestured toward her. "You may proceed." Victoria took a breath, and what came next would become the moment that defined not just this case, but her entire understanding of consequence. "First, I want to say that this entire proceeding has been a travesty. My attorneys have already filed appeals, and when those go forward, this conviction will be overturned. Everyone in this room knows it." She paused, letting that sink in. Second, the prosecution has painted me as some kind of villain, when in reality I'm the victim here. My reputation has been destroyed. My family's name has been dragged through the tabloids. I've had to endure death threats from people who don't understand the first thing about my life, or the pressures I face. In the gallery, reporters' pens flew across pages. Maria Santos, sitting in the front row in a wheelchair, her hands trembling from nerve damage, stared at Victoria with an expression somewhere between disbelief and devastation. Third, Victoria continued, warming to her theme now, her voice gaining confidence. I think we need to talk about proportionality here. Yes, there was an accident. Yes, someone was injured. But accidents happen every single day. People make mistakes. I've already suffered enormously for this. I've been publicly humiliated. I've lost career opportunities. I've been subjected to a media circus. At what point does punishment become persecution? Monroe's expression hadn't changed. He sat perfectly still, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, watching Victoria with the focused attention of a scientist observing a particularly interesting specimen. And frankly, Victoria said, and here her voice took on an edge of genuine indignation, I question whether this court has the appropriate perspective to judge someone in my position. With all due respect, Your Honor, my family operates at a level of public service and civic responsibility that most people can't comprehend. My father governs millions of people. He makes decisions every day that affect the entire state. I was raised in that environment, with those responsibilities, with that weight on my shoulders. The stress, the scrutiny, it's relentless. She was building now, her confidence growing with each sentence, convinced that she was finally making the courtroom understand what she'd been trying to explain all along. So when this court talks about accountability, I have to wonder, accountable to whom? To people who've never had to balance the complexities of a high-profile life? To people who don't understand that sometimes, when you're operating at the level my family operates at, the normal rules become, she searched for the word, complicated. The courtroom had gone absolutely silent. Even the court reporter's fingers had stilled on the keys, hovering motionless as if afraid that even the clicking of her machine might interrupt what was unfolding. My family doesn't answer to people at your level, Victoria said, and the words landed like a grenade in the center of the room. We answer to history. We answer to the electorate. We answer to the institutions that actually shape this country. This court is, and I mean no disrespect by this, a local mechanism. It serves a function, certainly, but it's not designed to handle cases involving people of significant influence. There should be a different process for people like us, people whose actions have broader implications, whose public service deserves special consideration. She actually smiled then, a small, satisfied smile, as if she'd just delivered a closing argument that would be studied in law schools for generations. Monroe let the silence stretch. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15. The tension in the room became almost unbearable. Then, finally, he leaned forward, his gray eyes fixed on Victoria with an intensity that made several people in the gallery shift uncomfortably in their seats. Ms. Ashford, he said quietly, are you finished? Yes, Your Honor, she replied, still confident, still certain she'd made her point. Monroe removed his reading glasses, folded them carefully, and set them on the bench in front of him. When he spoke again, his voice remained calm, but there was something in it now. A cold fire that transformed the temperature of the room. In 37 years on the bench, I have heard many things. I have listened to defendants proclaim their innocence in the face of overwhelming evidence. I have heard expressions of remorse so profound they moved me to tears. I have heard defiance, desperation, rage, and occasionally, genuine redemption. But what I have just heard from you, Ms. Ashford, is something I can only describe as breathtaking in its moral bankruptcy. Victoria's smile faltered. You stand before this court having been convicted of driving while intoxicated and causing injuries so severe that the victim will never fully recover. Maria Santos. Monroe gestured to where Maria sat in her wheelchair. A woman who spent her entire adult life healing others as a nurse. A woman who worked double shifts to support her family. A woman who followed every rule, hurt no one, and asked nothing from society except the basic protection of law. That woman's life was destroyed by your decision to get behind the wheel of a 2-ton vehicle while you were drunk. Monroe's voice remained level, but the weight of every word was crushing. She will never walk normally again. She will live with chronic pain for the rest of her life. Her family has been bankrupted by medical bills. Her daughter had to abandon her education. And you come before this court and call yourself the victim because your reputation has suffered. Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but Monroe raised one hand, and the gesture carried such authority that she fell silent immediately. Let me address your points one by one, Ms. Ashford, so that there is no confusion about how profoundly wrong you are. Monroe picked up a document from the file before him. You claim this conviction will be overturned on appeal. The jury in your case heard 5 days of testimony. They saw security footage of your vehicle striking Mrs. Santos. They heard testimony from the paramedics who found you stumbling around the crash site, reeking of alcohol, trying to call your father instead of checking on the woman whose life you'd just destroyed. They saw the toxicology reports showing your blood alcohol content. They deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a unanimous guilty verdict. Your appeals will fail, Ms. Ashford. The evidence against you isn't debatable. It's documentary fact. He set the paper down and picked up another. You claim you're the victim because of media attention and public scrutiny. Ms. Ashford, you chose to drive drunk. You chose to ignore the most basic responsibility we ask of anyone who operates a vehicle. The consequences of that choice include public accountability. That's not persecution. That's the natural result of your actions. You're not being punished because of who you are. You're being held accountable for what you did. Monroe's eyes hadn't left Victoria's face. She was pale now, her earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. Now we come to the truly remarkable part of your statement, Monroe continued. Your assertion that you operate at a level above the normal rules. Your claim that this court lacks appropriate perspective to judge you. Your suggestion that your family doesn't answer to people at my level. He paused, and in that pause, the full weight of Victoria's words seemed to settle over the courtroom like a thundercloud. Ms. Ashford, let me explain something to you about the American legal system. Something that apparently your expensive education failed to teach you. This nation was founded on a single revolutionary principle, that all people are equal before the law. Not all people except the wealthy. Not all people except the politically connected. Not all people except those whose fathers hold high office. All people, without exception. Monroe's voice grew harder. The robe I wear doesn't represent my personal authority. It represents the Constitution of the United States. When you stand before this bench, you don't stand before Elias Monroe, the man. You stand before the law itself, the same law that governs the janitor who cleaned this courthouse this morning, the same law that governs the President of the United States. There are no tiers of citizenship in this courtroom. There are no levels of people. There is only the law, and everyone answers to it equally. Victoria was trembling now, her hands gripping the edge of the defense table. You said your family answers to history, to the electorate, to institutions that shape the country. Let me tell you what your family answers to, Ms. Ashford. Your family answers to the same law as everyone else. Your father's position as governor gives him certain powers and responsibilities, but it doesn't place him above the law, and it certainly doesn't place you above it. If anything, his position should have taught you a greater respect for the law, a deeper understanding of civic duty. Instead, you seem to have learned only arrogance. Monroe picked up another document, the victim impact statement from Maria Santos. This court has read Mrs. Santos's statement. Would you like to know what she wrote? She wrote that she forgives you. After everything you've done to her, after destroying her health, her financial security, her daughter's future, she forgives you. She wrote that she hopes you get help, that you find a way to become a better person. That's who Maria Santos is. He looked directly at Victoria. And who are you, Miss Ashford? You're someone who stood before this court and complained about stress and scrutiny while showing not one moment of genuine remorse for the woman whose life you destroyed. You're someone who actually suggested that there should be separate rules for people like you. Do you understand how fundamentally that contradicts every principle this nation is built upon? The courtroom was so quiet that the sound of Victoria's sharp intake of breath was audible throughout the room. You spoke of complexity, of nuance, of special consideration. Here's what's not complex, Ms. Ashford. You chose to drink. You chose to drive. You chose to ignore the safety of everyone on the road that night. You made those choices knowing they were wrong, and you made them anyway because you believed you were special. You believed the rules didn't apply to you. And when you destroyed Maria Santos's life as a result of those choices, your first instinct was to call your father for protection rather than to render aid to the person you'd injured. Monroe paused, letting that sink in. This court has reviewed the sentencing guidelines, the recommendations from probation, the arguments from both prosecution and defense. Under normal circumstances, given the severity of your crime and the catastrophic harm you caused, I would sentence you to the maximum penalty of 15 years in state prison. Victoria gasped. Her attorney placed a hand on her arm, but she jerked away from him. However, Monroe continued, I am required to consider all factors: your age, your lack of prior criminal history, the possibility of rehabilitation, and so I arrive at the following sentence. He looked down at his notes, then back up at Victoria. You are hereby sentenced to 8 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 5 years. Upon release, you will be on supervised probation for 10 years. You will complete 2,000 hours of community service working with victims of drunk driving. You will attend substance abuse counseling. Your driver's license is permanently revoked in this state, and you will pay full restitution to Maria Santos for all medical expenses, lost wages, and pain and suffering, an amount that will be determined in a separate civil proceeding, but which I expect to be substantial. Victoria's legs buckled. She gripped the table to keep from collapsing. You can't. This is Ms. Ashford. Monroe cut her off, his voice sharp for the first time. You will remain silent, or I will add contempt of court to your sentence. She fell silent, tears streaming down her face now, not tears of remorse, but tears of someone finally confronting the reality that her name, her connections, her father's position meant nothing in this moment. Monroe wasn't finished. Furthermore, I want you to understand something. The sentence I'm imposing isn't about vengeance. It's not about making an example of you because of your family's prominence. It's about justice, actual justice. You took actions that destroyed another person's life, and now you must face consequences proportional to that harm. That's how the system works. That's how it must work if we're to call ourselves a nation of laws. He leaned forward slightly. You told this court that your family doesn't answer to people at my level. Let me correct that misapprehension. Your family answers to the law. I don't represent a level, Ms. Ashford. I represent the people of this state. All the people, from the wealthiest to the poorest. And in this courtroom, every person has the same value, the same rights, and the same responsibility to obey the law. Monroe straightened in his chair. You will have ample time in prison to reflect on the choices that brought you here. I hope you use that time wisely. I hope you emerge as someone who finally understands that being born into privilege doesn't make you special. It makes you responsible. Responsible to use your advantages to help others, not to harm them. Responsible to set an example, not to demand exemptions. He picked up his gavel. You spoke of history, Ms. Ashford. Here's what history will remember about today. That when a privileged young woman stood before the law and demanded special treatment, the law said no. Justice, true justice, doesn't see your father's title. It doesn't see your bank account. It sees only your actions and their consequences. The gavel came down with a sound like a gunshot in the silent courtroom. Court is adjourned. Bailiff, remand the defendant to custody. Victoria's attorney was already on his feet, filing objections for the record, but his words seemed to come from very far away. Victoria stood frozen as the bailiff approached. When the handcuffs closed around her wrists, real handcuffs, not the metaphorical constraints she'd imagined her family name would prevent, she finally broke completely, collapsing forward as if all the strength had drained from her body. This isn't fair, she sobbed. My father will. He'll fix this. He can. Your father is the governor, not a king, Monroe said quietly. And this is America, not a monarchy. Take her away. As Victoria was led from the courtroom, still sobbing, still unable to comprehend that her last name had failed to save her, Maria Santos sat in her wheelchair and watched. Her expression was impossible to read. Not triumphant, not vindictive, just infinitely sad. Sad for what had happened to her, perhaps. Sad for the young woman who'd never learned that actions have consequences. Sad for a society that produced people who genuinely believed themselves to be above the law. Monroe remained at the bench as the courtroom slowly emptied. A reporter approached the bar, hoping for a quote, but Monroe simply gathered his files and prepared to leave. He'd said everything that needed to be said. The law had spoken. Justice had been served. Not perfect justice, perhaps, because no amount of prison time could return Maria Santos to the life she'd had before that intersection, before that moment of impact. But justice, nonetheless. In the hallway outside, Victoria's father, Governor Richard Ashford, stood surrounded by his security detail and a phalanx of lawyers. His face was ashen. He'd heard about his daughter's statement in court, about her disastrous claim that their family didn't answer to people at the judge's level. Every political instinct in his body screamed that this would destroy his career, that no amount of spin could overcome the optics of his daughter proclaiming herself above the law. But beneath that political calculation, there was something else. A father's shame that he'd raised a child who could stand in a courtroom and show such contempt for the victim she'd maimed, such arrogance in the face of her own guilt. Back in his chambers, Monroe removed his robes and hung them carefully on their hook. Through his window, he could see the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. Somewhere in that building, Victoria Ashford was being processed into the prison system. Photographed, fingerprinted, issued an inmate number. Her designer suit would be replaced with prison khakis. Her expensive jewelry would be logged into property. The transformation from governor's daughter to inmate 247893 would be complete within hours. Monroe sat at his desk and opened the next file in his docket. A custody dispute. A man fighting for visitation rights with his children. Ordinary people facing ordinary problems, seeking the protection of law. He read through the preliminary motions, making notes in the margins, preparing for the next day's hearing. The law moved forward. It always did. Today, it had moved through Victoria Ashford's life like a wrecking ball through tissue paper, destroying the illusion that some people were special, that some families operated above the rules, that wealth and connections could substitute for accountability. Tomorrow, it would move through other lives, other cases, always grinding forward, always seeking that impossible goal of perfect justice in an imperfect world. Outside the courthouse, as evening approached, a small crowd had gathered. Some were supporters of Maria Santos, holding signs thanking Judge Monroe for his courage. Others were critics of the Ashford family's political dynasty, seeing in Victoria's conviction a long overdue reckoning. And a few were simply citizens who'd followed the case and felt that for once, they'd witnessed something that restored their faith in the system, a moment when power and privilege met consequence and lost. Judge Elias Monroe never saw those crowds, never heard their debates. He didn't sentence Victoria Ashford to make a political statement or to satisfy public opinion. He sentenced her because a jury had found her guilty, because the law required consequences, and because the woman sitting in that wheelchair deserved to know that her suffering mattered, that her life had value, that the system hadn't failed her even if one reckless young woman had. That's what justice looks like. Not perfect, not satisfying to everyone, but equal, blind to wealth, deaf to connections, focused only on the law and its application to all people, at all levels, without exception. Because at the end of every case, beneath all the legal arguments and procedural motions, there's a simple question. Do we mean what we say when we claim that no one is above the law? Today, in that courtroom, the answer was yes. If you believe in a justice system that treats everyone equally, regardless of their last name or bank account, hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel for more stories where accountability finds those who think themselves untouchable. And drop a comment below saying, "Justice for all," or telling us where you're watching from. Let's build a community that believes the law belongs to all of us, not just the privileged few.